Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ken Bamberger, the Rosalinde and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Professor of Law and the faculty co-director here at the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. I welcome you to the second talk in a three-part series featuring reporting with Nadav Eyal, prominent Israeli author and journalist, and one of the most insightful voices today on developments in Israel. This is the second online meeting, and I'm excited that Nadav will be joining us in person on campus in April. The Helen Diller Institute, in a word, provides a rich academic forum for the exploration of the breadth and complexity of Israel and contemporary Jewish studies. We have dozens of courses on Israel, a new Israel Studies minor, a robust undergraduate fellows program, and ongoing programs both on campus and public programs. And I hope you'll be able to join us 1 week from today as we host historian Ilan Troen on campus to speak about his new book, Israel-Palestine in World Religions, Whose Promised Land? Please refer to our website for all of our programs. All of these programs are dependent entirely on philanthropic support from the community, and we thank you for your continued support. So today I'm honored to welcome back Nadav Eyal. Nadav is a senior columnist for Yediot Ahronot, Israel's most circulated newspaper, and for the news website Ynet, where he writes a weekly column devoted to Israeli decision-making. He's also a senior commentator on Channel 12, Israel's most watched channel. And this year, he's at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs as a senior research scholar and adjunct professor of international and public affairs, during which he's continuing his writing and speaking in the Israeli press, in particular this fall about the 2024 US presidential election for Yediot. He's been covering US elections for the paper since 2008, and before the presidential elections in 2016, he created a series of short documentaries called Trumpland, which examined the global rise of populism and the serious prospect of a Trump victory. And he won Israel's equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize for his 2021 best-selling book, Revolt, The Worldwide Uprising Against Globalization. Welcome, Nadav.
Hi, Ken. I'm really happy to be with you again.
So glad to have you back. Last time that we spoke, Israel had just had a series of striking military and strategic accomplishments, and that occupied our discussion. My hope is that the focus of this second session is to look more at some of the broader internal dynamics going on in Israeli society. But of course, current news keeps breaking out, so that we'll weave both of them in. Let me start last Tuesday, of course, Election Day. Of course, an important day with the change in the American administration, the election of Donald Trump. But it was also the night that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu fired popular Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who had led Israel's war effort since October 7th. And after the firing, Gallant pointed to three issues leading to the split. First, the issue of the hostages and Gaza. He said that it's time to make a deal for the hostages and that the costs in lives of continuing Gaza and not trying to come to an agreement was too great. Second, he talked about the issue of conscripting men from the ultra-Orthodox Haredi sector at a time when there's a serious people power shortage in the army and the resulting toll on reservists. Two. And number three, he said the third division that led to my firing was the question of whether there would be a state commission of inquiry into the failures leading up to October 7th. And I note that that day and in the week that's followed, that day there was word of accusations related to serious improprieties in the Prime Minister's office relating to the theft of confidential military materials, maybe blackmail, and other efforts that might obscure such a reckoning. So maybe later you can explain that a little more. So with the Trump election in the back of our minds, let's go through some of these topics, and maybe you can help educate us a little about where the tears are in Israeli society. So the first, the hostages. What's the situation regarding the hostages? What's the state of mind of the Israeli people? What are the opportunities or lack of opportunities? And where's the government?
Yeah, Ken, these are huge questions as to the Israeli society, and I want to just open by saying that I think the first thing that people listening should remember about Israel right now is that it is a traumatized and a post-traumatized society. It's in the middle of a war that began on October 7 and didn't end. Factually speaking, it's only expanded. And for Israelis, in sort of a daily life basis, daily life today are as disrupted as they were, or even more disrupted than they were, say, at the end of October 2023, just a few weeks after Hamas raided the country and committed its actions of murder and ethnic cleansing in the south.
So say a little more about those disruptions.
And the reason for that is that, first of all, the country is enlisted. Many people are in reserve service, and that means that they don't go to work. They are not with their families, including and specifically on holidays. They can't go to university. Many of these people are young people. They are students if they are in the reserve service. So, of course, all the people who are serving as part of the mandatory service or the regular army, meaning it's their career choice, are there fighting, working very hard to support those who are fighting as part of the Israeli army. But Israel's defense doctrine is first and foremost founded on the notion of reserve service, and most of the Israeli army of the IDF is reserves. So these group of people who actually are at the front lines are really the backbone of Israeli society on so many levels, coming from the most industrious parts of society. And it is on them that most of the heavy lifting of this war is being done. And by heavy lifting, I mean that they are there practically, literally willing to sacrifice their life on a daily basis. The families back home know that. And almost on a daily basis, we get news of soldiers and officers, reserve or mandatory service, who have been killed in action, whether it's in the northern front fighting Hezbollah or in the south. Israel is not accustomed to that. This is a new phenomena of such a long war. Israel's longest war was, of course, the War of Independence back in 1948. And the current Israeli society doesn't have a physical living memory of that war. We read about this in books, and of course there are people around who are very much seniors by this time who have fought this war. But this is the first time in contemporary Israel that a war has been lasting for more than a year. And that means that economy is disrupted, family life is, heavily traumatized by these events. Just imagine what it is like to be usually the wife, but sometimes also the husband, but usually the wife of a reserve soldier and officer that is in the northern front with kids, knowing that you need to take care of everything at home, knowing that that reserve soldier is not going to go to work. He's supposed to be compensated by the state. It's always less than what he ought to get for his service. And your children live in fear that their dad, that there can be a knock on the door and a terrible news can come to them. And you yourself know this.
I'll tell you a personal story. I was in Israel 10 days ago. We had the graduation of the joint Berkeley Tel Aviv University LLM program that the Diller Institute and the law school runs. And it was already delayed a year. The graduation was supposed to be last fall. And a third of the graduates couldn't attend because they were reservists. And one reservist was let out, and he saw his 2-month-old twins for maybe the second or third time since they were born. So same day, a study came out that a third of the reservists have been in for over 150 days in the last year, and a significant chunk for more than 300 days. That's basically the entire year.
Yeah. And I need to say that although reserve service is a consensus within Israeli society to an extent, not everybody serves. The ultra-Orthodox don't serve in the army. They are given or were given a waiver by consecutive Israeli governments. It's very much debated. One of the reasons that Gallant was fired, and we're going to discuss this. Also, the Israeli Arab or Israeli Palestinian community doesn't serve in the army. They are exempt from serving in the army. And there are other groups within the Israeli society that serve less, or people that have served in non-combat positions, myself, for instance, who are not being called to reserve service, and or people who are over, I'm over, I'm 45. Most of the people my age are not called, but many are if they were combat soldiers. So you see sometimes 3 generations of the same family serving in a reserve service. And that's just one angle of a society in war. This is just really one angle, because you also have people who came back from the war and were wounded. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of people who were seriously wounded. And by seriously, I mean they lost a limb. And you see this in Israel quite a lot. Young people missing a leg or an arm, sitting next to you in a restaurant or in a coffee shop after they are back from hospital. And there are people who lost their loved ones on October 7th. And there are people who have been evacuated from their homes in the south and don't want to return or don't have a home to return to. And of course, you have dozens of thousands of people who have been evacuated by government order from the north, and some of them still living in hotel rooms, though most of them already moved from hotel rooms and are renting in some places, and their life have been completely just turned upside down. Sometimes I wrote extensively about the families of the people who were evacuated from the north. So if you get evacuated from your house, this doesn't mean, Ken, that you don't need to drive to your work. So sometimes you'll be evacuated, but then you need to wake up in the morning and commute for 2 hours, 2.5 hours with Israel's traffic to work, while your family lives in a hotel room. I can just go on. But this is what I mean by where is the Israeli society? And of course, on all of this sits the war itself. The war itself means that each day, just yesterday, we have learned about the death of 6 young men who were killed in a battle in South Lebanon with Hezbollah from Golani. You keep hearing these kind of news, and also you have this relatively new phenomena of armed drones or suicide drones that are entering the country again and again. The last time it happened was a couple of hours ago. And then they rotate in certain areas in the country. This could be, as south as Tel Aviv, and really to the center of Israel. And when they do that, even if it's just one drone, you see the entire country going to shelters and sirens going up and down, and people basically waiting for this drone to be traced or destroyed or for it to crash. And it did crash. It managed to do what it wanted to do just a few hours ago and hit a military base. So, and this, of course, entails, if you have kids, to take them to the shelter, sit with them in the shelter, make these explanations. So this region, this entire region, and Israel, which is my focus, are at war and are traumatized by the war. And the Israeli society will feel the burden of memories and sentiment out of this war for many years to come. And then there are specific issues that are sharing.
Too, one of our attendees wrote the question. There's, of course, the knowledge that of the tragic and serious destruction that's going on, in Gaza and in Lebanon. On top of all of that, it's not as if.
I want to say something about that. I'm speaking about the Israeli society. It's not because because I'm trying to deny or to downplay the human suffering in Gaza. Okay, I'm not. But because our session is focused on the Israeli society, and I feel I can talk with certainty about the Israeli society. There's enough suffering going on in the region, for many people, enough suffering. And this kind of situation is a sort of a war of attrition. The Israelis have been fighting a war of attrition that was launched against them by Hezbollah on October 8, by the Houthis, by the militias in Iraq, by Iran, that's been shooting at Israel and is still considering another response against Israel. And into this very complex strategic and societal condition enter issues that have always been part of the Israeli society and questions, and are resurfacing because this time brings with it its constraints and needs. And the best example that I'll begin with is the conscription of ultra-Orthodox Haredim who received a waiver. This historic waiver began with David Ben-Gurion with the foundation of the State of Israel. The ultra-Orthodox community almost didn't exist the way that we think about it today. There was what we call the old Yeshuv, the old Jewish presence in Eretz Israel. That old Yeshuv has nothing to do with the ultra-Orthodox that we're seeing today. It's not the same traditions. It's not the same languages. It's completely different. They are the ultra-Orthodox stemming out of basically Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, after the Holocaust, the general sentiment with the Israeli socialist secular elite is that the ultra-Orthodox are a dying breed, are part of a shtetl that will never resurface in Eretz Israel. And therefore, they were very lenient towards the requests coming from the ultra-Orthodox. And the main request was allow us to study the Torah, allow us to focus on our Talmud studies. We don't want to serve in the army. Also, serving in the army presents unique problems for ultra-Orthodox because the kosher stamp of the army isn't good enough for Haredim, for ultra-Orthodox, because of the presence of women there. At any rate, David Ben-Gurion decided to grant a very limited waiver. If I remember correctly, it was 400 or 800 waiver tickets for yeshiva men that can study all day long and not go to the army. In 1977, the Likud comes into power, and Menachem Begin decides to abolish the numeric limitation on that waiver, meaning if you apply the standards and if you stand by the standards, there can be no limit to the number of waivers given. And this suddenly explodes to a much bigger number than 800 or something of the sort. Now, it grew over the years relatively, okay, at any rate, with the population. But because the population of Israel grew from 600,000 with the foundation of the state in 1948, by 1977, it was a few million. So things changed at any rate. But when Begin came to power, the Likud had an alliance with the ultra-Orthodox that they wanted to keep, a new alliance, by the way, because the ultra-Orthodox usually were in the labor movement governments, but they felt more close ideologically with Israel's right wing, and Menachem Begin himself was much more of a traditionalist and much less of a secularist Jew, although he was secular. And to make this commitment ironclad, he allowed this waiver to expand. And today we have dozens of thousands. And if you look at the entire Haredi society, more than dozens of thousands of people who were supposed to go to the army, didn't go to the army, and are at an army relevant age, let's say between 18 to 40. And part of the arrangements within the Israeli society, which are very, very, it's an anomaly that, you know, I don't know of any anomaly like this anywhere in the world, is that if you go and get this waiver and study in the yeshiva, this means that you can't work, because all you're doing, you just told the army that what you're doing is only studying in the yeshiva. So you're basically a yeshiva student, and that's your work for life. And because of that, you can't go and actually have a real job until you're well into your 40s. Or I don't remember the waiver age. Maybe you remember the waiver age. There's a specific age in which people say, okay, you know, you're not going to be recruited to the army anyway. So this does two big things to the Israeli society that many things are harmful. The first thing is that it means that there's one law which is the law of the land, that when you're 18, you're going to go to the army. You know, and I have friends now, they have kids who are going to go to the army, and they're terribly worried about their kids. And this begins at the age of 16. You get your first sort of warrant from the army when you're 16. So I have a daughter, she's 14 now. In a year and a half, she's going to get her first, what we call Tzav Rishon, first letter from the army saying, hi, we're going to recruit you. You know, in 2 years' time, you're going to get recruited. And of course, if you have a daughter, that's one thing. If you have a son and you know he's going to go to the army, if he's healthy, he's going to go to a combat unit. But if you're an ultra-Orthodox and you grew up in a Haredi community, and it doesn't really matter if you're a great student or you're not, and if you actually go to the yeshiva or you don't, you're going to get a waiver. Now, the Israeli society knew how to live with this anomaly for many years because we didn't have this kind of war. So it wasn't really, it was on the agenda. It was always on the agenda. It was always an explosive subject, but it wasn't a practical subject. It was a principled debate. Nobody thought that this is because the IDF needs these people. Actually, at certain points, people said, well, the IDF is actually, it doesn't need so many soldiers. It's releasing soldiers because it's a small army and there are peace process. And, you know, so maybe this thing is behind us. And maybe the IDF should become a regular professional army, just paying people and no mandatory service, or having some sort of a half and half model like you have with the National Guard in the United States, or something like that, right? So the first issue is about equality. It's about equality. And the second issue is about participation in the job market, because when you apply this anomaly, you actually also say that these young men who are at the prime of their life are not going to work, or they're going to work, but they're going to work in the black market, labor market, meaning that they're just going to work without you knowing and without paying taxes, because they don't want to lose their status as yeshiva students, and they need to go to the army. So it's a double whammy on Israeli society, and it blew up during the war from a very simple reason. And that is, as you mentioned, Ken, people are spending hundreds of days in the reserve service. Sometimes, yeah, they're fighting in the fronts, but sometimes, they're just, I don't know, guarding a settlement somewhere. And this is something that if you would have 20,000, 15,000 more recruits, conscripts, say yeshiva students, you can actually practically have less weight put on the shoulders of our reserve soldiers. And people have become really angry. And this has become from a center-left issue to a consensus within the Israeli society, including in the right, including in the religious right, and specifically with Tzionut Datit, religious Zionism, which is really bearing the brunt of this war. Religious Zionism in Israel, whether living within the sovereign state, living beyond the green line in settlements, doesn't matter. Religious Zionists are, with no doubt, the demographics that has sacrificed more than any other during this war in terms of the number of people who were killed in action. And it's not a big community. It's not a huge community, okay? And these are people who are Orthodox. When we say religious Zionism in Israel, we usually mean Orthodox. So they're not ultra-Orthodox. They're not Haredim. So for them, this is especially infuriating. They are observant Jews. They go to the army. They don't see the problem with the ultra-Orthodox doing that. And also there's a, societal tension because the ultra-Orthodox continue on to condescend, to be frank. Religious Zionists basically say, we're religious, and they treat them differently. And there's a lot of pressure there anyway, right? But this has completely exploded in the war.
So then we add some law to that. The Supreme Court strikes down the broad exemption and says it violates the principle of equality, and that the government has to come up with some way to enlist at least Haredim. And an announcement is made that 7,000 draft notices are going to go out, I think it was going to be last Wednesday, to Haredi 18-year-olds, saying you too will be conscripted, and the whole issue with Galant is teed up.
Yep. And the thing with Galant is as such. Galant, when the Supreme Court made their decision that you need to have a law, it's not that the Supreme Court is saying to the country, to the state, look, you need to conscript everyone right now. What it said to the government is you need to have a law that will be constitutional if you want to grant waivers, or else you need to conscript everyone because you're not operating under law. You cannot give this waiver without having a legal foundation. It cannot operate with a sort of a tzetalach, the Tzetalach method, which is in Yiddish, if I'm not mistaken, like pieces of paper.
Or we would say it violates equal protection.
Yes, but if you do have a law and it is a reasonable law, for instance, we're gonna enlist 3,000 the first year, 5,000 the second year, and so forth. If you do have a law, the Supreme Court will hold the law probably to be constitutional. So what Gallant said after that verdict is, I am not going to push through a bluff of a law, and the law that I intend to advance through the Ministry of Defense is going to be a law that is within the Israeli consensus, which is actually meant that he wants the agreement of at least one big opposition party, and that party was Machaneh Mamlechti, led by Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, which are both former chiefs of staff. So he was saying to Netanyahu, to his coalition and to the ultra-Orthodox partners, if you're thinking you're going to use the defense ministry apparatus in order to push a law that will actually be an exemption and will be just dead letters, dead words, I'm not going to agree to that. And I am insistent that it's going to be a real thing. And his ally to that was the chairman of the Defense and Foreign Relations Committee in the Knesset, Yuli Edelstein, who is the former Speaker of the Knesset, and who thinks, relatively the same. Both of them are Likud. And this enraged, of course, the ultra-Orthodox that saw this as treason, and mainly Netanyahu, who saw this as an attempt to actually overthrow the government. Why would Gallant want to overthrow the government? And the answer is doesn't really want to overthrow the government. He just thinks after October 7 and being the defense minister responsible for the army, that it's impossible for him to give the cold shoulder to the fighters. And this is basically what he said in his speech after he was fired, that he couldn't betray them by agreeing to such a law. And then he was replaced with Israel Katz, who was the foreign minister and has no security credentials, as far as I know, whatsoever. And the hope with the ultra-Orthodox and with Netanyahu is that now the Likud would be able to summon up a coalition that will pass a law that will make sure that the ultra-Orthodox don't enlist. Now, this is causing huge repercussions politically within the Israeli society. One repercussion is that one party, Bezalel Smotrich party, that could be described easily as a far-right party, is not passing the threshold in polls for parliament, for the Knesset. And they're not passing because they were supported mainly by religious Zionists. And, I keep hearing my friends saying that they're not going to support a guy who wants to give waiver to the ultra-Orthodox. So the alliance between religious Zionism, politically speaking, and between the ultra-Orthodox was broken. And that can also lead, potentially, although I don't think it will happen, to a break between many religious Zionists and between the right wing. Because most of the right wing wants to give the ultra-Orthodox the waiver so that the government survive. When I say most of the right wing, I mean political operatives in government, not polls. In the polls, this is very unpopular. And I should say something generally about this government, and that is the government, the Netanyahu government, is very unpopular since its inception in January 2023. And the reason that the government hasn't won a single poll, reputable poll, since March 2023 is not because of the judicial overhaul. It's also because of the judicial overhaul, but it's mainly because of this alliance of the far right, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and the ultra-Orthodox parties, and the sentiment that this coalition has given the ultra-Orthodox everything they wanted to begin with. and that it has gone completely overboard. And they have lost a lot of their support with the Likud secular demographics that used to support Netanyahu. And many of these mandates of this support, these percentages, these points are not there anymore, although they might return. So I just summed up, I know we don't have a lot of time, but I just summed up, the conscription issue.
Okay, so we on the conscription issue, we have a fissure in the traditional alliance that's in Netanyahu's coalition, and kind of a coming together of what you might call the productive sectors in society and the ultra-Orthodox, which cuts across Netanyahu's base. All right, so let's put that
But
there.
also it brings about a really big question about Israeli society's future. Because if you look at demographics and you look at birth rates, you see that with ultra-Orthodox women, it's more than 6 children for a household. I think it's 6.9, but let's say more than 6 for sure. And if you look at, what you could expect to the future, you see that the ultra-Orthodox community is going to become bigger and bigger in Israeli society. And the participation in the job market of men there, by the way, not of women. Ultra-Orthodox women do go to work in a satisfactory labor participation. But if you look at men, they don't, and they also don't serve in the army. So people are saying, how is this society supposed to survive? If the biggest element of the Israeli society is growing, and growing at not a quicker pace, but double the pace of everyone else, is bent on not serving in the army, and from the men not to be working, at least not officially, what does it mean about the future of the Israeli society? So what the war has done, like wars do sometimes, this is what wars do. It has brought this dilemma and debate as to the future of the Israeli society and the future of its relationship with the ultra-Orthodox community, with the Haredim, to the forefront of our public debate. And many people would say, this is it's a healthy thing that it happened now. It's unfortunate that these are the circumstances, because as far as the Israeli politicians are concerned, and I mean everyone, I want to be fair, this is also true for the center left, as it is true for the right, because they need the support of the ultra-Orthodox in order for their governments to operate, they would have agreed to anything. And because the feeling was that the IDF doesn't need more soldiers. So, why not? And even if they do, politicians will convince themselves that it's much more important to form a government right now. And then we're going to have a plan, and it's going to be, future looking, and it needs to be somehow moderated to the society. And at the end of the day, a few thousands will be enlisted, all of these bluffs. So one of the things that happened during this war, and it's true about geostrategy as it is true about the Israeli society, and I think it's also true for societies around us, that the era of bluffs is over. As far as Gaza is concerned, you don't really get to have a pseudo state that's ruled by fundamentalists bent on destroying their neighbors and somehow manage to for this polity to survive. And at the same time, you don't get to have a first-rate economy like Israel and the Middle East when you actually say to large chunks of your population that they don't need to stand by any sort of mandatory military service, or they don't need to be equal to other citizens, and I can go on. There are other bluffs that were exposed during this war.
Let's talk about the hostages. The second issue, and a thorny one, where the fissures might come down differently, where very prominent ultra-Orthodox rabbi this week made a speech that there is no more important Jewish value than getting back the hostages. Obviously, a point of dissension may be moot, because if the Biden administration is correct that it is in fact Hamas who really is not available for some kind of deal, then maybe it's moot. But it is also a searing issue in Israeli society. What to do, how to end this war. Gallant says now's the time. There are still, by best count, maybe 50 hostages who are still alive. What's happening on that front?
First of all, the possibilities for a deal, right now it looks stuck. So just factually speaking, talking with my sources, talking with the sides, it's stuck. Qatar announced that they're backing off because the sides are not serious. There's a huge discussion if Qatar, to begin with, was a good way to go, considering that they're supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood notions, supportive of Hamas. We're supportive of Hamas. Many people think that Israel should have just gone with Egypt, for that matter. And of course, winter is approaching. Hostages that are still alive are deteriorating physically, sometimes being starved. We know that the 6 hostages that were murdered by Hamas were actually practically starved. All of the hostages are tortured or are subject to physical treatment that amounts to actual torture. They are constantly psychologically tortured, and this is something that we have heard almost from every hostage that came back. And of course, they are abused, specifically women. These are, points of data that we know, and not only because of intelligence, we also know this because people came back and told the stories. And those who came back weren't there more than a year, but just several months before they came back in that deal, and less than several months. And those who are still there, either underneath the ground or maybe not underneath the ground, are suffering from these conditions. And the general assessment within the Israeli defense apparatus is that, we might be losing a hostage every 10 days or every 20 days, but we're losing the hostages. So time is really of the essence to get them out. And unfortunately, it seems that although the urgency of the now is so heightened, political urgency isn't. It's not something that is, it's central to the continued discourse about the war. But I know you're following the news in Israel. You probably see that this is not the major headline every day, and not every second day, and not every third day, because, people are dying in the north fighting Hezbollah, or because there's a new corruption scandal with the Prime Minister's office, or because there's a new president in the United States, and he nominated a cabinet that's very favorable for Israel or for the Netanyahu government. But the hostages issue, because nothing is moving, there are no new news there. It's only a constant nightmare for the families who are going from meeting to meeting, from demonstration to demonstration, trying to keep this as part of the public sphere. And the fact is, as you mentioned, that the Biden administration a few months ago, and I heard it myself from officials and senior officials within the Biden administration basically said, before Sinwar was killed by Israel, that the reason we don't have a deal is because of Hamas. And by saying that, to a large extent, they put a lot of responsibility with Hamas, which I think as an Israeli is a good thing, because I have absolutely no doubt that Hamas is playing with this cynically, and that they definitely don't care about the lives of the hostages. And some of the things that I explained since the beginning of the war, when I said that, so people would say, yeah, so why do they keep the hostages? They do care. They want to get prisoners, or they want to get rid. And one of the things that I sort of said, and I'm saying to you, and are very, very unfortunate, is that Hamas knows that they don't need this number of hostages alive to get what they want from Israel, because they have the precedent of the Shalit deal, in which Israel released 1,000 prisoners for just one hostage, Israel led by Netanyahu. So I think that the thinking with Hamas is, we don't need 100 hostages alive. Don't need them. In order to free all the prisoners, it's not needed. We can do with less. And also, I think that to a large extent, Hamas has been carried by those messianical fantasies of the Sinwar brothers, that the all-out war against Israel by Iran, by Hezbollah, they, from time to time, they have a new hope of of the war escalating to the point that Israel will fall on its knees and will ask for a ceasefire and for a pullout of Gaza, and they'll have all the cards. And these are really messianical fantasies. Just looking at what's happening in the region during the war, it's not going that way, right? So when the Biden administration is saying it's the responsibility of Hamas, I completely relate to that. But I should say, politically speaking, that when it's said, it also lifts a lot of the responsibility politically from the Israeli government, right? Because then the Israeli government is saying, what do you want from us? And they're practically saying this, the problem is with Hamas. Even the Biden administration is saying that, right? And I think that to a large extent, the Biden administration never understood how to play that well. Because when they tried to pressure Israel, Hamas was emboldened. And when they put the responsibility and the blame with Hamas, which I feel, squarely speaking, that it's more with Hamas than it is with Israel, then they got a lot of pushback from Israel and from the allies of the prime minister that don't want a deal. And because they are threatening to overthrow the government if there's going to be a deal that will mean that the war is over and the IDF is pulling out of Gaza. So this is where we are stuck at. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons that I'm more hopeful with the Trump administration. And, I know I'm speaking with many people who might have not voted for this side or the other. I'm just saying now, as far as the hostages are concerned, there needed to be a change. And, if the Biden administration in its final days wants to try and do something, and the president-elect wants to do something, there is now a golden opportunity to move things around, simply because, as Reagan did at the time with the hostages in Iran, I don't know how many people remember that he did that before his inauguration, right?
So 1979 American hostages are taken in the U.S. Embassy, devastating to President Carter's reputation. And the Iranians kind of finagled it that as a kind of a final hit on Carter, they would be released right after Reagan is inaugurated.
Yeah. And I think that maybe because Trump does carry a lot of popularity with Israelis, and he can basically tell Netanyahu whatever he wants, considering how his cabinet looks and considering that Israel is very much focused on Iran, and maybe also pressure Qatar, maybe this could move things. But this is really wishful thinking. I have no indication that President Trump is focused on that. I know that he has spoken about this with President Biden. I know that the Israeli President Herzog has spoken about this with President Trump. I know that these things have risen. I don't know of any person in his circle that is right now dealing with that. But the entire hostage issue is crucial for the Israeli society. It's about the idea of solidarity, of Kol Israel Arevim Ze Lazeh. It's about the idea that it's a difficult neighborhood, but we're here together. It's also very political for the families. Most of the families, not getting them back is a betrayal. They put the responsibility on the shoulders of the government. It's their government. They expect the government to do whatever to get sometimes the kids back home. These are people who have been abducted from their beds in pajamas, or soldiers that are 18 years old. Sorry, Ken, there's a electricity thing that I'm taking care of for a second.
No problem.
That, 18-year-old soldiers, female soldiers that have taken hostage during their mandatory service. People expect their government. And I think that one of the things that is being misread sometimes around the world is that they see the demonstrations in Israel and they sort of assume that there is more responsibility placed by the demonstrators on the Israeli government. That's not the case. The demonstrators are saying, we want them back. We want this to be part of the news cycle. We are demanding the government to do their job, defend these soldiers and citizens, get them back. We don't care how. If they could, they would have demonstrated in Gaza, demonstrated against Hamas. They don't care how this is going to happen. So many of them will say, I don't want to misrepresent this. You talk with Einav Tangokel, the mother of an Israeli that is held there. She would say, I blame the prime minister. I blame the prime minister. And she says that because they don't want a deal. Okay, they're saying that. But many families will say, we really don't care who's to blame. We want Israel to be as aggressive as it can in getting the deal. And there is friction there. Many people within the Israeli defense apparatus think that Hamas wants a deal, although the Biden administration said that they don't. They're saying this to the families. I wouldn't have quoted it otherwise. They're saying to the families, we think that now is the golden opportunity and Hamas wants a deal. And many people will say, no. Mainly the political, but not only political, also intelligence reports will say Hamas doesn't want a deal. They are in the middle of infighting on who's going to rule Gaza after Yahya Sinwar is dead. It's Mohammed Sinwar, or is it the other faction? And the one thing they don't want to do now is a deal. And they don't care about the lives of the hostages because they know that they can get a lot of prisoners back with much less of the hostages than they have today. So it's factually debated. It's also a matter of principle. It's also a matter of politics, because the far right doesn't want Israel to downgrade its operations in Gaza. The far right is dreaming about building settlements in northern Gaza. So it's a big issue, and it's tearing Israeli society. And by the way, Hamas knows this. And Hamas is running, even though it's, fighting in Gaza for its life, Hamas is managing influence campaigns on social networks against Israelis in Hebrew using the hostage issue. And they're doing that because they know how Israelis are sensitive to the hostage issue. So they are playing and using demonstrations, protests, and of course the condition of the hostages in order to try and make Israelis fight each other, and of course increase their bargaining power towards
including videos of hostages.
Yeah, of course, they're releasing
Hostages,
videos of
which-
hostages with dictated messages that are very synchronized to the narrative and discourse in Israel, very relevant. They're using exactly the right language in order to try and influence the Israeli society. And you see this, I'm seeing this as a journalist, and there are huge dilemmas here, which come even from game theory. If you amplify how the distress of the hostages, because it needs to be part of the news cycle and pressure your own political class, will it not make the other side push for more concessions, leading to less possibility of actually getting a deal done? This is a question that I think people constantly ask, even between themselves. Not journalists, but just regular citizens are asking, maybe if we talk about this less, the possibility of this happening will actually increase because the other side won't be entangled with fantasies of what they can get. It's a problem from hell.
Let me pick up on the point you touched on about who's responsible for mistakes or repairing mistakes, which was Gantz's third point. He said, I'm pushing for a state commission of inquiry into the mistakes of October 7th, not something that Netanyahu wants. In fact, we don't know all of the facts because it's under a judicial gag order as the investigation is happening, but it seems like there are charges. Maybe you can tell us what's going on, by which Netanyahu or Netanyahu's chief of staff or other people in the Prime Minister's office orbit have been engaged in some kind of behavior to try to avoid ultimate responsibility for October 7th.
Okay, so yeah, but these are actually, Ken, these are two questions. One of them is about the state commission. Netanyahu doesn't want a state commission. He managed to go through his reign, his consecutive terms as prime minister, without forming one state commission, because state commission in Israel is a big thing. I don't think the US has this kind of state commission with power as Israel does. A state commission in Israel is not only a commission to find the truth, like the Warren Commission after the Kennedy assassination. In Israel, the state commission has the power, for instance, to say, you are not going to serve anymore this country in this position. So state commissions in Israel can say, and they did, for instance, to Ariel Sharon after the Lebanon first, or during the first Lebanon war, after the massacre in Sabra and Shatila, that was directed and executed by allies of Israel, the Christian militias. There was a state commission, the Khan Commission, and they said this guy, Ariel Sharon, was a famed general, cannot serve as a defense minister anymore. And that was the end of his career as a defense minister. And it went to, I don't think it even needed to go to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court upheld the idea that state commissions can actually say, you're not fit for office, period. Now, this is, of course, we can talk democratic theory. I know that your field is law. You can absolutely debate this. Should we have this kind of state commissions that can actually, commissions that can say, instead of the public, you're not qualified anymore, but at any rate, this is the risk for Netanyahu. This is the reason he doesn't want a state commission, because if there is even a slim chance that this commission, which is going to be led by a Supreme Court judge nominated by the president of the Supreme Court, and of course, we know the history of Netanyahu and the judicial branch. He just tried to, he says, to reform it. people like me would say, to destroy it. So giving basically potentially his political life to the president of the Supreme Court to nominate a judge, and that judge and other members will sit in a room and will see, and that's another thing, every material, because they have security clearance to see everything, absolutely everything, for 6 months, and to have an operation around it, like you have in commissions or basic committees in the Senate. That's something that Netanyahu doesn't want. So he's trying to escape this continuously. But it's not only about that, it's also about narrative. And the scandals with the Prime Minister's office are all about narrative and controlling the narrative. You have a spokesperson that has been under arrest in his office for the last, I think, 10 days. And he was arrested because there was an extremely secret intelligence document that was leaked, probably through him, to foreign press in order to give an impression that Hamas doesn't want a deal, when Israel was negotiating a deal. Now, the offense there is not the manipulation. The offense is that this was really what people sometimes call black material. This was the highest security clearance possible, and it was stolen from an army computer, delivered to the Prime Minister's office, and then leaked somehow through maybe the spokesperson. And people would say, yeah, but if it's the Prime Minister, it can't be leaked, right? So, and that's a point I think made by President Trump at the time, that he can, there's no security clearance.
He can mentally declassify things.
He can declassify. Well, first of all, Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Ministers can do the same. So if I get a story from the Prime Minister and it's secret and he tells me that, he's not breaking any rule. And I think that this story is not going to develop because at the end of the day, it's the Prime Minister who gave that story. And I think he's having a hard time. I'm speculating by saying that it's the Prime Minister. If it's not the Prime Minister, it's his spokesperson. Okay. So this is the guy who's under arrest. He wanted to give that story away, but this is very damaging politically and internationally, maybe. And it's not going to lead to, Netanyahu being out of office or anything like that. But he didn't want to just say, and he could end this entire affair, entire scandal, by saying, yeah, I thought that this document needed to be out because I believe the document. It's a true document. It wasn't forged. That there's a strategy with Hamas to do this and that. And, I made sure that it came out. But for him, it's to own up to this, and he doesn't want to do it. Another story, which is actually a story that I published, and his chief of staff was just under 5 hours investigation because of that story, is that they wanted to change parts of the protocols of probably phone calls that the Prime Minister got on the morning of October 7th. And that's more of a serious issue. Because the first issue is declassified material was moved from, an army computer to the Prime Minister's office, not under protocol. That's a security violation. But the other one is about, trying to forge protocols, after the fact. And that's a big thing. If this happened, that means, whoever did that, if someone did that, can go to jail for a long time. Trying to change protocols of security updates to the Prime Minister after they were given is a big thingy, I think. And he was under investigation. I suspect nothing, although I published the story, I suspect nothing's going to come out of it in terms of an indictment, because I don't think the police is very motivated. Just to give you an example, I published the story in July. The story stemmed from Netanyahu's military secretary, who is a general, who sat down and wrote a letter to the Attorney General of the country saying, I suspect that, criminal offenses as to protocols are being, carried out in the Prime Minister's office. And I didn't know that there was an investigation. I published that he sent that letter. Now, he's a general, he's a senior figure and a very important figure in any prime minister's office. Your military secretary is, he was there on October 7th, and he sent that letter to the attorney general. By the way, he was handwriting the letter. So there are no copies to this letter because he felt that this is such a big story. And I published about this letter in July, and the police investigated the chief of staff today for the first time, and we're in November. So, and they raided the prime minister's office, by the way. The police raided the prime minister's office 2 weeks ago. So I don't know. I don't want to be the judge of that. Maybe they did, secret stuff underneath. They didn't want this investigation to be evident, but I already published it in July, right? So when I published it in July, they should have raided the place, investigated the person. I don't understand that. And talking with police reporters, the general sentiment is that the police wants this story to go away. And the police in Israel is very much weakened. Police ministry is controlled by Itamar Ben-Gvir. So it's still not done. Both investigations, one of them will lead to indictments, the one about leaking secret information, but it will not lead to the prime minister, and will not, prime minister is not going to be prosecuted for security information, given to the press. It's not going to happen in Israel. And I don't think it should happen, by the way, if the prime minister himself is responsible. And as to the second protocol story, I don't think it's going to materialize into an indictment. And basically speaking, it's all about responsibility. It's about owning up to what happened in October 7. And one of the reasons that fired Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was so popular is that he took responsibility, and he was very clear that he thinks that he should lose his job at a certain position, and Netanyahu wasn't.
So maybe I'll take a couple of questions and put them together, and we can spend the last few minutes of our time on that, which jumps off of this. Here we have Bibi, who has refused to take any responsibility, which is hugely unpopular, has refused to go visit the kibbutzim destroyed on October 7th, extremely unpopular, has in every poll the lowest trust rating, is currently embracing a highly unpopular policy of exempting ultra-Orthodox, is letting the far right in his coalition make noises about resettling Gaza, and an idea that it is wildly unpopular with 95% of Israelis, and yet he's Netanyahu. So how is he balancing all of this and still surviving, and throw Trump in there? What's the future?
Yeah, well, it's not that he's just only surviving. He's growing stronger.
Yeah.
You did the bucket list of all the things that I think the assumption is that should have led him to be widely unpopular. So first of all, he's more popular today than he was ever since October 7th. So he's more powerful today. Secondly, his government isn't falling. And this is because Likud members aren't turning their backs to the prime minister. Simply, it's up to the Likud members in Knesset. The party loyalists are with him. Netanyahu has an echo chamber of his own media that supports him. Channel 14 supports him. I don't want to equate it to anything in the US, but Channel 14 is highly, highly supportive of the prime minister, and there are no anomalies there. Okay, so And then you have
I've heard it called the Fox of Israel. I know you can't say any of this. I've heard it called the Newsmax of Israel.
no, it's definitely, I think really seriously, I think this is an injustice to Fox to say that it's the Fox of Israel.
Okay.
Seriously now, not ironically. And he has his online networks, the ways that in which he managed to survive and prosper in an environment of a media that's very critical of him for many years. So to your question, Ken, I don't think that he feels terribly, that he worries for his political life right now, specifically after Trump was elected president. And for him, the Trump election was a sort of vindication because he was in direct conflict with the Biden administration on some issues. Let's not exaggerate with that. Relations never deteriorated to the point of the later days of the Obama administration. But there was a direct confrontation there. And now he's getting the cabinet of his dreams in the US. Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. Waltz is national security advisor. Mike Huckabee as the ambassador to Israel. Mike Huckabee is, just plainly speaking, I'm not making this as sort of a judgment of character or anything. He's to the right of the prime minister. Huckabee is saying things that are to the right of Netanyahu. So for Netanyahu, this is extremely comfortable and an ideological vindication to an extent. And he also made, he was betting that Trump's going to win and win big. And he once made this mistake in 2012 when he made the bet that Mitt Romney is going to beat Obama. Obama's going to be a one-term president. And that was a terrible, terrible gamble. And, I criticized Dermer and Netanyahu for making it at the time. But right now, he's enjoying the fruits of that gamble with the Trump people. Now, I don't know what it means to the future. I don't know what the president is going to do. And I know that Trump, to an extent, is unexpected. And Netanyahu knows that too, by the way. He understands that. But I think that this is basically, if you look at this politically, the best condition that the prime minister has been since October 7th.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, Nadav. You have really laid the table for us, understanding where the moving pieces are in Israeli politics and society. And so much is uncertain, but luckily we will have you with us in April to help understand what will have happened between now and then. And take a look forward. I thank everyone in attendance for coming, and I really hope that you can join us in person in April when Nadav's here, and next Thursday night when Ilan Troen is on campus. So thank you, Nadav. Such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, Ken. Thank you.
Take care.